As the Russian incursion into Ukraine enters its fifth week, the United States and its European allies continue efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Is now the right time to focus on a deal with a terrorist state like Iran? And what, if anything, would the U.S. gain from it? Here to weigh in on all of that and much more is foreign policy expert and media analyst, Dr. Walid Phares. Walid, thanks for returning. I want to begin with the Iran nuke deal that the Biden administration and several European allies have been working to resurrect. The talks in Vienna were halted earlier this month following Russia's demands for written guarantees from the U.S. that the sanctions imposed on Moscow over the Ukraine crisis will not harm its economic and technical cooperation with Iran. Why is the Biden administration willing to engage a nuke deal negotiated by Russia?
That's the biggest question of this month, my friend. Actually, if we didn't have a precedent under the Obama administration, I would say, well, we'll give it a try and see what happens. Unfortunately, in 2015, when the Obama administration signed the original deal and started to forward billions of dollars to the Iranian regime, what did they do with it? Did they support their people, middle class, reform, make peace with Israel? No, they actually bought weapons, a lot of ballistic missiles. And with those missiles, they fired them on Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kurdistan, most recently, and us. So the timing is terrible. In the midst of a Ukraine war, we would open the valves of money to this regime without this regime committing to change behavior. Is a big mistake, in my view.
Israel and several other Middle Eastern countries have been against this Iran deal from its inception in 2015. Now, during a press conference in Israel on Sunday, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken tried to soothe those Israeli fears and its Gulf state allies ahead of the expected renewal of this Iran nuke deal. Listen.
We are both committed, both determined that Iran will never acquire a nuclear weapon. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is another reminder of why this is so important. An Iran with a nuclear weapon or the capacity to produce one on short notice would become even more aggressive and would believe it could act with a false sense of impunity.
Since the 2015 agreement, Iran has gone back to enriching uranium, Walid. Do the Israelis and other Middle Eastern countries have a good reason to be concerned about this renewal of the pact?
Not just the Israelis, and we know that they have all the reasons, existential reasons, that if Iran will obtain those nukes, they already have the ICBMs, and the Iranian leadership has said on and on that they want to destroy Israel. So that's not even an issue. But other than Israel, you have the Saudis, the UAE, Bahrain. Now Egypt is coming to this alliance, the Kurds, minorities in the region. So the question really is, Raymond, why at a time where 90% of U.S. allies in the region are against that deal, and still the Biden administration wants to sign the deal and send that money to Iran? It's really mind-boggling.
Reports from Washington suggest, Walid, that the administration is about to cave to one of Tehran's conditions for returning to the deal, and that's the removal of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from the State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations. Now, just last week, the IRGC took responsibility for a missile attack near the American consulate in Erbil, Iraq, in Yemen. They had provided those Houthi rebels with advanced drones to attack civilian targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE that you mentioned earlier. Why would this administration even consider removing Iran's guard unit from the terrorism list? And what kind of message does that send to Hamas and Hezbollah?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, in normal negotiations, and I've seen many negotiations during my life, first thing you do is that the other regime, the Iranian regime, or even their Revolutionary Guard, will commit to something. Will say, okay, now you are going to stop these sanctions. We, in turn, will stop any action in the region. That didn't even happen. I mean, we are sending them money while they are still saying and committing that we are firing those ballistic missiles. I mean, in the history of diplomatic relationship, Since the Persians and the Greeks, I have not seen anything like that.
No, well, and you just mentioned it on Wednesday. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announced new sanctions against Iran's ballistic missile program in response to that Erbil missile attack earlier this month. When asked if those sanctions would endanger the nuclear talks during Wednesday's press conference, White House Communications Director Kate Bedingfield said this.
No, not at all. In fact, these sanctions are not connected to the Iran deal. They demonstrate, in fact, what we have always said, which is that we will continue to hold Iran accountable for its missile proliferation and support to proxy networks as we work diplomatically to place strict limits on its nuclear program. So that will be true whether we are back in the nuclear deal or not.
Walid, how effective are sanctions when you tighten them here and you drop them over here? I mean, will this do anything to deter Iran's missile ballistic program?
You know, those statements seems to me like cartoon. I mean, you want to remove the RCG, the organization, the Pasdaran, from the list of terror, okay? They are the ones who are firing ballistic missiles on our allies and on our interests. How can you connect both? I mean, they say they're not connected. They are only connected. I mean, the Iran regime, first of all, should withdraw its militias from Iraq, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Yemen, or at least make an announcement that I'm not interested anymore in that behavior, and therefore I am ready to enter an Iran deal. None of it is happening. It's like telling Nazi Germany, okay, we'll sign a deal with you, and the Germans are moving on the ground, you know, occupying France and the Benelux, etc. There is something utterly wrong. I think the real answer is that there is a lot of pressure by major financial interests here and in Europe on the administration to sign that deal no matter what, and that's very sad.
Under the terms of the new nuke deal, the Biden administration is considering allowing Russia to buy Iran's excess enriched uranium, according to U.S. officials. Members of both parties have expressed concern about this. Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, the second most senior Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, said Russia's pariah status in the international community, quote, changes the dynamics of the talks. 49 Republican senators, Walid, claim the deal appears likely to deepen Iran's financial and security relationship with Moscow and Beijing, including through arms sales. Now, will this Iran deal serve to forge a closer relationship among Iran, Russia, and China, Walid? Is that what's going to happen here?
It's already happening. It's a game. It's theater. The Iranians are telling the Russians, okay, let us sign. We'll get the cash, and with our cash, we'll buy weapons from you. Same goes for China. I mean, third graders would understand this equation. This is an alliance. This is an axis between China that has signed already an agreement with Iran last year. Russia has the agreement with Iran. So all what the Iranians are doing, they're telling their associates, guys, let me get the money from the United States, and then I'm going to buy my weapons from your markets. I mean, is it that difficult to understand?
No. No. And what about this report that under this nuke deal, Russia will be building nuclear reactors for Iran to the tune of $10 billion, Walid? So we're sanctioning them while we're giving them a $10 billion gift over here in a deal that Russia negotiated.
Look, you don't need experts anymore. You just answered it. Basically, we are putting sanctions on Russia, right? And following the billionaires getting their yachts and all that stuff. Okay, on the one hand. On the other hand, we are telling the Iranians, yes, you can give $10 billion to the Russians from this specific deal. I mean, this is really stunning. The architects of this deal, especially the American architects of this deal, have to answer many questions to Congress, I think, now or next year.
Yeah. Moving on to the situation in Ukraine, earlier this week, the Russian military said it had, quote, drastically reduced its activity near Kiev. However, later in the week, Russia intensified its bombardment of nearby cities and seems to be continuing the attack on Kiev. At this point, how should the U.S. and Europe be engaged with Russia?
First of all, what the West needs to do, NATO, that is in particular, including Washington and Brussels, is to understand what the Russian leadership is doing. Not just about Mr. Putin. He's not alone. It's a system. So the priority for the Russian leadership is not in Kiev originally. They have done an offensive around Kiev to use it as a card. That's exactly what they're trying to do in the negotiations. So they encircle Kiev, and every 2 days they say, well, we are withdrawing from this neighborhood, from that village during the negotiations. Where is the real action taking place? In the east, where they are forming those two republics, probably they're going to annexate those republics. In the south, they are now in full control of the coast of most of these ports. Hence, it explains why they are making sure to take over Mariupol, etc. So the Russians have a plan, and we are looking where the Russians do not have a plan, which is in Western Ukraine at this point in time. So we need to design a strategy that would deter the Russians. Obviously, we don't want war. We don't want to commit our troops, but that's what we need to be doing at this point in time.
I want to shift to the Middle East. In Israel, at least 11 Israelis have died in 3 attacks over the past week. Fearing more, the Israeli military is sending 12 additional battalions into the West Bank and 2 additional battalions to the Gaza Strip. As you know, the peace negotiations with the Palestinians have stalled. They've been stalled for a long time. Do you see any promise of reviving them at this point?
Look, I'm going to be honest with our viewers and share with them what I think is the situation. These operations, in my view, in my modest view, are not about the West Bank, are not about the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, because if that is the case, they could have taken place before, years and years before. What was happening at the same time? That same week, Raymond, what was happening in Israel? A meeting of the Abraham Accord allies in the Negev. You had Egypt, you had the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco came. We were there as United States. So it looks like to me that the architects of these operations from far away wants to destroy this alliance between Israel and the Arab countries by creating Arab problems inside Israel. I would see it that way. That's what was the case for many, many years before. And I think I have a couple of suspects on my mind.
In an interview with Israel's communication minister, Yoaz Hendel, he said the current reality is unacceptable, and what we've done up to now hasn't been enough. Proof of that is that we're in a war. Hendel went on to say that Israel may soon need to launch a military operation similar to Operation Defensive Shield. That was when Israeli soldiers entered Palestinian towns, seizing weapons, arresting and killing militants. That operation lasted for years, became known as the Second Intifada. Do you see something like that happening again, Walid?
I hope that those attacks that took place within Israel at that critical time are not going to drag Israel into a war within the West Bank, but should put Israel and the Arab partners together in a campaign to remove the threat. The threat are Hezbollah, the threat is Hamas, and all these networks that are funded by Iran that, in my view, are trying to bring Israel to break its relationship with this wonderful alliance, the Abraham Accord. So I think the Israelis and the Abraham Accord Arab partners understand it, and they will act accordingly.
Before I let you go, where does the Biden administration stand on those Abrahamic Accords that were forged under the Trump administration? Have they sort of ignored them, not played a role in continuing them?
They didn't ignore them, but they didn't do more. The previous administration was responsible for 80% of the additions. This administration could have done more. We know that we have good relations with many countries who are waiting for the United States to bring them along with Israel. But more important is the pressure we're putting on Arab allies of Israel when they are facing off with Iran. Like, we are putting pressure on the UAE and Saudis not to go full-fledged against the Iranian-backed Houthi in Yemen. Why? Is it because of the Iran deal? I think so. We are putting pressure also on the Israelis not to go very strong against the Iranians by telling them, look, we will protect you, but effectively, we are withdrawing from the Middle East. We are reducing our forces from Iraq. We did from Afghanistan. So we need to recalibrate this policy, and hopefully the next Congress will sit down with this administration and try to find alternatives to what we're having right now.
Walid Phares, thank you for being here, for your insight. You can follow Dr. Phares on Twitter @Walid Phares.